A German shepherd planted himself in front of a stranger's minivan and would not move, no matter how many times the frantic manager screamed at him to get lost. Everyone in that parking lot thought the dog had gone rabid. Nobody noticed the tiny fist punching weakly at a car seat buckle inside, or the off-duty Navy SEAL medic, who was already sprinting across the asphalt with his heart in his throat. What he found in the back of that vehicle would blow this quiet town wide open, and it would take federal agents, a furious grandmother, and one very loyal dog to bring the truth into the light. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from tonight. And if stories about courage and second chances mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The town of Larkspur Hollow sat tucked into a valley in the Blue Ridge foothills, the kind of place where the fog rolled down off the mountains every morning like a slow gray tide and burned off by 9. Main Street still had a hardware store with a wooden porch, a diner that served the same 3 specials it had served for 40 years, and a grocery store called Fenwick's that anchored the only real parking lot in town. It was late September, and the leaves on the maples lining the square had just begun to blush at the edges. It was the kind of scene that belonged on a postcard, and that was exactly why Ryan Colt had chosen it. Ryan was 34 years old, a chief petty officer, and combat medic with a Navy SEAL platoon, currently on a rare stretch of convalescent leave after a rough deployment overseas. He didn't talk about the deployment. He didn't talk about much of anything if he could help it. He had the build of a man who had spent 15 years being asked to carry other men's weight, both literal and otherwise, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with quiet gray eyes that moved over a room, the way other people's eyes moved over a menu. He wore a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, work jeans, and boots that had seen more dirt roads than pavement. He looked, to the average stranger, like any other guy in a small mountain town buying groceries on a Tuesday afternoon. Beside him, moving in perfect step, was Duke. Duke was a German shepherd, 5 years old, with a thick black and tan coat and the kind of alert, intelligent eyes that made people cross to the other side of the sidewalk, without quite knowing why. Duke had spent 3 years as a certified military working dog before a training injury to his hip had ended his active deployment status. The Navy hadn't wanted to just retire him to a shelter. A soldier of his caliber deserved better than that. Ryan had put in for adoption the moment he heard Duke was being decommissioned, and the two of them had been inseparable ever since, in the field and out of it. Duke didn't wear a vest today. He didn't need one. He walked a half step behind Ryan's left knee, calm, watchful, present in a way that most house pets never manage to be. Ryan had come to Larkspur Hollow because his Aunt Carol had passed the winter before and left him her old cabin at the edge of the woods, and because after the deployment he just had, he needed somewhere quiet to remember how to be a person again. Instead of an instrument of violence, he told himself he was here to fix the porch steps and repaint the shutters. Really, he was here to learn how to sleep through the night without waking up reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Duke, in his own way, was doing the same thing. Trauma doesn't only live in human nervous systems. It lives in the twitch of a working dog's ears, at a car backfiring 3 streets away, in the way he still automatically swept a room the moment he entered it, checking corners nobody had asked him to check. Ryan had grown up 2 states over, the son of a long-haul trucker and a school cafeteria worker, neither of whom had ever set foot outside the country, and both of whom had been baffled and quietly terrified the day their only son announced he was enlisting in the Navy straight out of high school. He had never been the biggest kid in any room or the fastest, but he had always been the one who noticed things, who remembered which exits led, who read a room's temperature before anyone else in it had finished their first sentence. It was that quality, more than raw physical talent, that had eventually carried him through Boudou's training and into a career defined by exactly the kind of quiet, careful vigilance most people spend their lives trying to avoid. He had met Duke almost by accident, filling in for an injured handler during a joint operation that had nothing to do with either of them originally being paired together. Something about the dog's steady, unshowy competence had struck Ryan immediately, the same quality he valued in the best operators he'd ever served alongside. A total absence of ego, a complete focus on the job at hand, regardless of how much credit or attention it earned. When Duke's hip injury ended his active deployment eligibility 2 years later, Ryan hadn't needed to think twice about the adoption paperwork. Some partnerships simply aren't optional once you've lived through enough together. The two of them had spent the last 3 weeks in Larkspur Hollow doing the slow, unglamorous work of learning how to be civilians again. At least temporarily. Ryan split shingles and reset porch boards during the day and sat on that porch most evenings with a beer he rarely finished, watching the fog roll down off the ridge while Duke patrolled the tree line at the edge of the property out of habit rather than necessity. Neither of them had expected the quiet to break the way it did on a Tuesday afternoon in a grocery store parking lot. But then again, neither of them had ever really believed the quiet would last forever. Men and dogs built the way they were built tend to sense, on some level, that stillness is only ever a pause between missions, never a permanent state. That particular Tuesday had started like every other day since Ryan arrived. He woke before dawn out of habit, did his physical therapy stretches for the old shrapnel wound in his thigh, made coffee too strong for anyone but himself, and took Duke for a long walk along the ridge trail behind the cabin. By early afternoon, the fog had burned off and the sun sat high and gold over the valley, and Ryan decided it was as good a day as any to finally restock the pantry, which had been reduced to a box of crackers and half a jar of peanut butter, since he'd arrived 3 weeks earlier. He drove his old pickup into town, parked in the gravel lot outside Fenwick's grocery, and clipped a leash onto Duke's collar more out of local etiquette than necessity. Small towns had opinions about big dogs, even well-behaved ones, and Ryan had learned it was easier to keep the leash on and let people relax than to explain that Duke would never move a muscle without a command telling him to. People often assume that the ordinary rhythm of daily life is a permanent, guaranteed thing, that grocery runs and small talk and parking lots will always be exactly what they appear to be. They rarely stop to consider that danger doesn't announce itself with sirens. Sometimes it just idles quietly in a minivan with the windows cracked 2 inches, waiting for nobody to notice. Ryan looped Duke's leash around a bike rack near the entrance, the same as he had the last 3 times he'd shopped here, and told him to stay. Duke sat immediately, back straight, eyes tracking Ryan through the sliding glass doors until they closed. He was a patient animal. He had waited in far worse places than a sunny parking lot. Inside, Ryan moved through the narrow aisles with the efficient economy of a man who had spent years learning to do everything with the fewest possible movements. He grabbed rice, canned beans, coffee, a rotisserie chicken, some greens for a salad. His body kept begging him for after months of field rations. He was standing in the checkout line, half listening to 2 women in front of him discuss the high school football team's chances that weekend. When he heard it, it was distant at first, muffled by glass and distance, but Ryan's ears had been trained for over a decade to isolate the sound of distress from background noise, the same way a mother can hear her own baby crying over a crowded room. It was a dog barking, not the excited yip of a dog greeting its owner, and not the aggressive warning bark of territorial defense. It was rhythmic, insistent, and it did not stop. Ryan set his basket down on the conveyor belt without a word of explanation and walked briskly toward the doors. The cashier called after him, confused, but he didn't slow down. His body already knew, on some level below conscious thought, that something was wrong. Combat teaches a person to trust that feeling instead of arguing with it. He pushed through the sliding doors into the parking lot and found Duke straining against his leash at the bike rack, barking directly at a gray minivan parked 3 spaces down, its engine still running, its hazard lights blinking uselessly. The dog's whole body was rigid with purpose, front paws braced, tail low and stiff, exactly the posture Ryan had seen him take 100 times before when he'd located something the team needed to find. A small crowd of shoppers had begun to gather at a nervous distance, phones half raised, unsure whether they were witnessing a dangerous animal or something else entirely. The store manager, a heavy-set man in a green Fenwick's polo whose name tag read Gary, was jogging toward the scene, red-faced and furious. "Hey, get your animal under control before I call animal control myself," Gary shouted, waving his arms, as if that would do anything to a dog who had once been trained to hold position under simulated gunfire. "We can't have him scaring customers like this." Ryan didn't answer him. He unclipped the leash from the bike rack and let Duke lead, which the dog almost never got to do. Duke didn't strain toward the store or toward any of the onlookers. He went straight to the minivan's rear passenger door and pressed his nose against the glass, whining now instead of barking, a lower and more urgent sound. That was when Ryan heard it too. A baby was crying inside the van, not the healthy red-faced wail of a hungry infant who knows help is 30 seconds away. It was a weak, hoarse, exhausted cry, the kind that comes after a baby has already been crying for a long time, with nobody answering. Ryan's training took over completely. He cupped his hands against the tinted glass and looked inside. In the back seat, strapped into a rear-facing car seat, was an infant who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 months old, her tiny face blotchy and red, her onesie soaked through with sweat. The van's engine was running, which meant the air conditioning should have been on, but Ryan could see condensation building on the inside of the glass in a way that told him the system had been shut off, or was broken, and the interior was baking under the September sun like a greenhouse. There was no adult in any of the seats. The van appeared, at a glance, to be completely empty except for that one small, desperate child. "Somebody call 911 right now," Ryan said, his voice carrying the flat, immediate authority of a man who had given emergency orders under fire more times than he could count. Nobody moved. He said it again, louder, pointing directly at a teenager holding a phone. Now, tell them a baby is locked in a hot car, unresponsive adult, unknown, Fenwick's grocery parking lot." The teenager fumbled his phone and started dialing. Gary, the manager, was still sputtering about liability, and the dog completely failing to grasp what was actually happening 6 feet away from him. Ryan tried the door handles. All 4 were locked. He tried the sliding side door. Locked. He looked through every window for a spare key, a purse, anything that might indicate where the driver had gone, and saw nothing. The temperature inside a closed vehicle on a sunny day, even a mild 72-degree day like this one, can climb by 20 degrees in 10 minutes and 40 degrees within the hour. Ryan didn't need a thermometer to know the baby inside that van had likely been sitting in dangerous heat for far longer than 10 minutes, judging by how weak and hoarse her crying had become. A crying baby with strong lungs is a good sign. A baby who has cried herself past the point of strong crying is a baby running out of time. "Duke, back," Ryan commanded, and the dog immediately retreated 3 full steps, clearing space. Ryan grabbed the small tire iron he kept clipped inside his jacket, a habit left over from years of needing to improvise tools in bad places, and without a second of hesitation drove the blunt end into the rear passenger window. The safety glass spiderwebbed and then caved inward with a crunch. He reached through the shattered opening, unlocked the door, and had the child out of her car seat in under 4 seconds, cradling her head the way medics are trained to handle a possible injury, checking her breathing, her pulse, the color of her lips. She was hot to the touch, her skin flushed and clammy, but she was breathing, and when the cooler outside air hit her face, she let out a fresh, stronger cry that Ryan had rarely in his life been so relieved to hear. A weak cry is a warning sign. A strong cry means the body still has fight left in it. "She's alive, she's breathing, get me water now," Ryan barked at the crowd, and this time people scrambled to obey, because there is something about a calm, competent voice in a crisis that cuts through panic faster than any amount of shouting ever could. Duke stayed pressed against Ryan's leg the entire time, no longer barking, simply watching the baby with an intensity that looked, to more than one onlooker, remarkably like concern. The seconds while they waited for the ambulance stretched out in a way that only ever happens in genuine emergencies, each one somehow both instantaneous and endless. Ryan kept the baby's airway clear, murmuring low, steady reassurances that had nothing to do with the actual words and everything to do with tone, the same voice he used with wounded men in far worse conditions than a sunny parking lot. A voice built to convince a frightened body that help had already arrived even before it technically had. A woman from the gathering crowd, a retired nurse named Ellen who lived 2 streets over, pushed forward with a cool, damp cloth from her own grocery bag and helped Ryan press it gently against the baby's overheated skin, working in wordless coordination with the calm efficiency of 2 people who both understood exactly what mattered in that moment and what didn't. Duke stayed pressed against Ryan's leg throughout, no longer barking, watching the infant with an intensity that looked, to more than one onlooker, remarkably like concern, occasionally leaning his head down to nose gently at the baby's small foot, as if checking for himself that she was still breathing. Gary, the manager, had stopped shouting about liability entirely by this point, standing a few feet back with his hand pressed over his mouth, the full weight of what had almost happened only now beginning to register on his face. The teenager who had called 911 stood frozen with the phone still pressed to his ear, relaying updates to the dispatcher in a voice cracking slightly with adrenaline, while the 2 women who had been discussing high school football just minutes earlier now stood in stunned silence, one of them quietly crying without seeming to notice she was doing it. The ambulance arrived within 11 minutes, siren wailing down Main Street, and the paramedics took over from Ryan with a practiced efficiency of professionals grateful that someone had already done the hardest part for them. The lead paramedic, a woman named Denise with 20 years on the job, looked at the baby's vitals, looked at the shattered window, and looked at Ryan with something close to awe. Another 20 minutes, and we'd be having a very different conversation, she said quietly, so only Ryan could hear. Whoever left her out here nearly killed this kid. That single sentence would turn out to be the first thread in a story far darker and far more tangled than anyone standing in that parking lot could have imagined. The baby was rushed to Larkspur County Medical Center, where doctors confirmed she was suffering from moderate heat stroke and dehydration, but would make a full recovery thanks to how quickly she'd been removed from the vehicle. The story should have ended there, with a grateful town and a happy ending on the local news. Instead, it was only the beginning, because nobody could find the baby's mother anywhere. The minivan, once officers ran the plates, was registered to a woman named Priya Halstead, 26 years old, a nursing assistant who lived in a small rental 2 towns over. Priya was nowhere to be found. Her cell phone went straight to voicemail. Her employer said she hadn't shown up for her shift that morning, which was unusual for her, since coworkers described her as reliable to a fault. Nobody at the daycare she used had seen her either. She had simply vanished, and her infant daughter had been left alone in a locked, running vehicle in a grocery store parking lot 40 miles from her own home, in a town she had no known connection to whatsoever. The local police, led by a heavy-set, unhurried sheriff named Wade Purnell, treated the whole thing initially as a tragic but straightforward case of parental neglect. Sheriff Purnell had been the law in Larkspur Hollow for 19 years, and in that time he'd built a reputation as a man who liked simple explanations and disliked complications, particularly complications that might inconvenience anyone with money or influence in his county. He interviewed Ryan for less than 15 minutes at the scene, took his statement about breaking the window, thanked him for his quick thinking, and seemed entirely satisfied to file the whole incident under case closed, mother to be located and charged. Ryan wasn't satisfied. Something about the scene had been nagging at him since the moment he pulled that child out of the car seat, and it took him until that evening, sitting on his aunt's porch with Duke's head resting heavy across his boots, to put his finger on exactly what it was. The van's engine had been running, not idling roughly the way a car does when it's simply been left on by accident, but running smoothly, as though someone had very deliberately started it and left it that way. And there had been no purse in the vehicle, no diaper bag, no phone, no evidence of the ordinary chaos of a young mother's car. It had been almost too clean too staged, like a scene assembled, rather than a scene abandoned in a panic. More than that, Duke's reaction bothered him. Ryan had worked with military and police dogs for years, and he knew the difference between a dog alerting to distress and a dog alerting to something else entirely, something more specific, a scent trained deep into muscle memory. Duke hadn't just heard the crying and reacted the way any sympathetic animal might. He had gone straight to that particular vehicle, in a lot full of a dozen other cars, before Ryan had even come outside to hear the crying himself. That level of certainty, that speed, suggested Duke had caught a scent he recognized, something that had triggered a specific, trained response, rather than a general one. Duke had spent 18 months of his active service attached to a joint task force working narcotics and human trafficking interdiction along the southern border before his transfer to Ryan's unit. He had been trained, among other things, to alert on the specific chemical signature of certain sedatives commonly used to keep trafficking victims, including infants, compliant and quiet during transport. Ryan sat very still on that porch for a long time, turning the thought over, hoping he was wrong, and increasingly certain that he wasn't. The next morning he drove back into town and asked to see Priya Halstead's case file, only to be told by a board deputy that it wasn't public information and that the sheriff's department had it well in hand. Ryan pushed a little harder, mentioned his military background, mentioned Duke's specialized training, and was met with a kind of polite, immovable wall that small-town bureaucracies build when they want a problem to simply go away on its own. "Folks around here appreciate what you did, Mr. Colt," the deputy told him, not unkindly but very firmly. "But this is a domestic matter. Probably a young mother who got in over her head and panicked. Happens more than you'd think. Best let us handle it." Ryan had spent enough years around institutions that protected the comfortable and dismissed the inconvenient to recognize the shape of that sentence for what it was. He thanked the deputy, walked back out to his truck, and sat behind the wheel with Duke in the passenger seat. Thinking, "They don't want to look too hard," he said out loud, mostly to the dog who tilted his head at the sound of his handler's voice. Question is why. He decided to start with the hospital. If Priya Halstead had family, someone would have been notified about her daughter's condition. When Ryan arrived at Larkspur County Medical, he found a woman in her 60s sitting alone in the pediatric ward waiting area, her hands twisted together in her lap, her eyes red, rimmed from crying. This was Margaret Halstead, Priya's mother, who had driven 3 hours from her home, in the next state the moment the hospital called her as the emergency contact, listed in the child's records. Margaret was a small, steel-spined woman with silver hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and the kind of exhausted, wary dignity that comes from a lifetime of being underestimated and proving people wrong. Anyway, when Ryan introduced himself as the man who had pulled her granddaughter, whose name turned out to be Sunny, from the overheated van, Margaret's composure cracked completely, and she gripped his hand so hard, her knuckles went white. "Thank you," she said, over and over before she managed to say anything else. Thank you, I don't have words." Once she'd steadied herself, Ryan asked the question that had brought him there. Did Margaret have any idea why Priya would have been in Larkspur Hollow, a town she had no connection to, or why she might have left her daughter alone in a running car and simply disappeared? Margaret's face changed instantly, the grief giving way to something harder and more frightened. She glanced around the empty waiting room as though checking for listeners before she spoke again. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "My daughter would never, ever leave that baby alone. Never, not for 1 second. Something happened to her, Mr. Colt. Somebody did something to my girl." She hesitated, then added the detail that would change the entire shape of the investigation. "Priya's been working nights at a private home care facility outside of town for the last few months. A big estate. She told me the pay was good, better than the hospital, but she'd also been acting strange lately. Scared. She called me 2 weeks ago and said she'd seen something she shouldn't have at the estate, and that she didn't know what to do about it. She wouldn't tell me what. She said it was safer if I didn't know, Ryan felt the old, familiar cold clarity settle over him, the same feeling he used to get in the field the moment a routine patrol turned into something else entirely. "What estate?" he asked. Margaret's answer was the name that would eventually bring federal agents into Larkspur Hollow in the dead of night. "The Ashcombe Place. Everyone around here calls it Ashcombe Manor. It belongs to Desmond Ashcombe. Big pharmaceutical money, I think, or real estate." "Something like that," Priya said. "The family kept mostly to themselves, but they had a lot of visitors coming and going at strange hours. Cars with out-of-state plates, sometimes in the middle of the night." Desmond Ashcombe, it turned out, was not merely a wealthy local eccentric. He was the largest landowner in 3 counties, the primary donor behind the sheriff's last 2 re-election campaigns, and, according to the framed newspaper clippings, Ryan later found archived at the tiny local library, a man who had personally funded the new wing of the very hospital Margaret was currently sitting in. He was, in every sense that mattered in a town like Larkspur Hollow, untouchable. That evening, Ryan didn't go home. He drove out along the county road that wound past Ashcombe Manor, a sprawling stone estate set far back behind iron gates and a quarter-mile of manicured private drive, visible only as a collection of lit windows through heavy tree cover from the road. He parked a safe distance away, well outside any camera range he could identify, and let Duke out of the truck. "Find," he said quietly, holding out one of Sonny's small hospital socks, still faintly carrying the scent of the infant. And, if Ryan's suspicion was correct, whatever chemical residue had been used to keep her quiet during transport. Duke put his nose to the ground and worked in careful, methodical arcs, exactly the way he'd been trained, moving along the tree line, parallel to the manor's outer wall. It took nearly 20 minutes, Ryan following in absolute silence, before Duke's body language changed entirely. He went still and low near a section of the estate's outer wall where a service gate stood, tucked out of sight of the main entrance, clearly meant for deliveries and staff rather than guests. Duke sat and stared at that gate with the same unwavering intensity he'd shown at the minivan the day before. Ryan didn't approach the gate itself. He had spent enough years in hostile environments to know the difference between gathering intelligence and blundering into a firefight unprepared, and whatever was happening behind those walls. He had no evidence yet, only instinct and a dog's nose, neither of which would hold up in any court or convince a sheriff who had already made up his mind. He memorized the layout, noted 2 security cameras mounted at the service gate and a third at the main entrance, and walked back to his truck with Duke close at his heel. The next several days became a careful, quiet campaign, the kind of patient information, gathering that Ryan's training had drilled into him far more thoroughly than any local detectives. He learned from the diner's morning regulars who gossiped freely once they realized he was the man who'd saved the Halstead baby that Ashcombe Manor employed a rotating staff of home health aides and nurses, most of them from outside the county, most of them young women who didn't stay long. He learned that Desmond Ashcombe had a business partner named Victor Wren, who visited frequently and who nobody in town particularly liked, a man described uniformly as cold, watchful, and always trailed by 2 large men in dark suits who never seemed to actually do anything except stand near doors. He learned from a records clerk at the county courthouse, who owed his late Aunt Carol a favor from years back, that Ashcombe Manor had been the subject of 3 prior noise and disturbance complaints. In the past year, all filed by neighboring property owners, all mysteriously withdrawn or dismissed within days of being filed. He learned that Sheriff Purnell's re-election campaign 2 years prior had been almost entirely funded by a political action committee, whose largest single donor was a shell company registered to an address that, when Ryan looked it up, traced back to Victor Wren. Piece by piece, a picture began to assemble itself, ugly and enormous, far bigger than one missing nursing assistant and one nearly lost baby. Ryan didn't have proof of what exactly was happening at Ashcombe Manor. Not yet, but every instinct honed by 15 years of reading dangerous situations told him it was something that involved moving people, moving them quietly, moving them in ways that required sedation and secrecy, and a sheriff who had learned not to ask too many questions. People often mistake the absence of visible chaos for the absence of danger, assuming that quiet, wealthy places are inherently safe simply because they are quiet and wealthy. They forget that the very same money and quiet that makes a place look safe is often the exact currency used to bury the truth. On the 5th day after the parking lot incident, everything accelerated at once. Ryan was at the hospital visiting Margaret and checking on Sonny's recovery, which was going well, when Margaret's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered it out of desperate hope, the same hope that had kept her sitting in that waiting room for 5 days straight, praying for any word about her daughter. The voice on the other end was distorted, clearly disguised, and it delivered a single chilling message before disconnecting: stop asking questions about the manor, or the next thing found abandoned in a parking lot wouldn't be breathing. Margaret collapsed into a chair, shaking uncontrollably, and it was in that moment, watching a grandmother threatened for simply wanting to know why her daughter had vanished, that Ryan's careful, patient information gathering shifted into something far more urgent. He called an old teammate, a man named Hollis Grant, who now worked as a liaison between the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and various federal task forces, a connection Ryan had maintained since their overlapping deployments years earlier. He explained everything: the baby, the van, Duke's alert, Priya's disappearance, the threatening call, Ashcombe Manor, the suspicious pattern of dismissed complaints, the sheriff's donor list. Hollis listened without interrupting, the way trained investigators do, and when Ryan finished, there was a long pause on the line. "If even half of what you're describing is real," Hollis finally said, "this isn't a local matter anymore. This sounds like it could be tied to a trafficking network we've had loosely on the radar for the better part of a year, moving through private care facilities along the Eastern Corridor. We've never been able to pin down a physical location. Don't do anything else on your own, Ryan. I mean it. Let me make some calls. Give me 48 hours. 48 hours, Ryan thought, looking at Margaret's shaking hands and thinking of Priya Halstead somewhere out there, possibly still alive, possibly running out of time, exactly the way her daughter had been running out of time in that parking lot 5 days earlier. 48 hours felt like a lifetime when someone else's life was the clock running down. He didn't wait the full 48 hours. He compromised with himself, the same way any disciplined operator learns to compromise between patience and urgency, and gave it 24, using the time to gather every scrap of additional evidence he could without tipping his hand. On the second night, under cover of a heavy autumn rainstorm that he judged would mask both sound and movement, Ryan drove back out to the tree line near Ashcombe Manor's service gate, dressed in dark clothing, Duke moving silently beside him off-leash, both of them falling into the old rhythms of reconnaissance that neither man nor dog had ever really forgotten how to perform. He was not there to breach the property. He told himself that clearly, repeatedly, the entire drive out. He was there to observe, to gather what evidence he could from outside the wall, to photograph vehicles and license plates that might corroborate what he already suspected, material that could hand federal investigators something concrete, instead of a veteran's gut feeling and a dog's nose. What he found, crouched in the wet undergrowth, with a small pair of night vision, binoculars borrowed from his old gear locker, chilled him to the bone. Just before midnight, a panel van with out-of-state plates pulled up to the service gate, and two of Victor Wren's suited men emerged to unload something from the back, moving quickly, glancing around with the practiced nervousness of people who had done this many times before, and were still afraid of doing it wrong. Ryan couldn't see clearly enough through the rain and darkness to identify exactly what or who was being moved, but the careful, urgent secrecy of it told him everything his instincts needed to know. Duke pressed low against the ground beside him, let out the faintest, barely audible whine, a sound Ryan recognized instantly. It was the same alert Duke had given at the minivan. The dog had caught the scent again, the same chemical signature carried on the wind from that unloading van. Ryan made the only decision his conscience would allow. He called Hollis immediately, relayed exactly what he was seeing in real time, gave precise coordinates and vehicle descriptions. And for the first time in the conversation, heard genuine urgency crack through his old teammate's professional calm. "Do not move," Hollis said. "Do not approach. I am calling this in right now as an active operation. Local law enforcement is compromised. You've made that clear, so we're bypassing them entirely and going straight federal. Stay exactly where you are and keep eyes on that gate. Backup is coming. Ryan, just hold position." Ryan held position. It was, in many ways, the hardest order he had ever followed, crouched in freezing rain, a few hundred yards from a wall behind which, he was now nearly certain, human beings were being held, and moved against their will, forcing himself to wait for a system he had spent the last week learning not to fully trust. The 40 minutes Ryan spent waiting in that tree line were, in their own quiet way, some of the longest of his life, longer in some respects than certain firefights he could remember, because at least in a firefight there was something immediate to do with his hands. Here there was only stillness, cold rain finding its way past his collar, and the low, steady thrum of his own pulse in his ears as he watched that service gate and forced himself not to move. Duke lay pressed flat against the wet ground beside him, utterly silent now. Every ounce of his earlier restlessness converted into a kind of coiled, patient readiness that Ryan recognized from a dozen overwatch positions in far more hostile places than a mountain county road. Twice during the wait, headlights swept briefly across the tree line as vehicles passed on the county road behind him, and both times Ryan felt his whole body go still, calculating angles and cover without consciously deciding to, old habits surfacing instantly the way they always did whenever the stakes climbed high enough. Neither vehicle slowed. He made himself breathe, made himself remember that he was not technically in a war zone, even though every nerve in his body seemed to have quietly decided otherwise. At one point he caught movement near the manor's main entrance, far off through the rain and trees, a second dark sedan pulling up the long private drive. And for a moment he debated whether to report it to Hollis immediately or wait until he had more information. He chose to wait, watching through the binoculars as two more of Wren's men emerged to greet whoever had arrived, their body language relaxed, almost bored. The posture of men who had done this exact routine so many times it had stopped registering as dangerous to them at all. That more than anything else Ryan observed that night told him how long this operation had likely been running undisturbed, and how completely Sheriff Purnell's silence had allowed an entire criminal ecosystem to calcify into routine. 40 minutes later, headlights began appearing on the county road behind him, not the flashing lights of local police cruisers, but the disciplined, blacked-out convoy formation of a coordinated federal response. 3 unmarked SUVs rolled to a stop, well short of the manor's main gate, doors opening with the quiet efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of operation more times than they could count. A woman climbed out of the lead vehicle, moving with the brisk, no-nonsense authority of someone used to being the most senior person in any room. This was Special Agent Renata Ochoa of the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had spent the better part of the last year chasing exactly the kind of shadow network Ryan had just stumbled into. Hollis Grant emerged from the second vehicle beside her, and the two of them moved directly toward where Ryan and Duke were still crouched. At the tree line, "Chief Colt," Ochoa said, crouching down beside him without ceremony, her voice low and urgent. "Talk to me fast. What have you got?" Ryan gave her everything in under 2 minutes, the disciplined, compressed briefing style of a man who had delivered hundreds of them under far worse conditions. The van, the unloading, Duke's alert, the layout of the cameras, the location of the service gate. Ochoa listened, nodded once, and turned to her team. "We move now," she said. "Full breach. All points and somebody get animal control standing by in case this K9's nose is as good as this man says it is, because I want him working that property the second it's secure." What followed was the fastest, most coordinated operation Larkspur Hollow had ever seen, and one that most of its residents wouldn't learn the full truth of for weeks. Agents moved on both the main gate and the service entrance simultaneously, breaching quickly and quietly, securing the grounds before most of the household even had time to react. Ryan was ordered to stay back initially, a civilian on an active federal operation, no matter how many years he'd spent doing exactly this kind of work in uniform, and he forced himself to comply, standing at the tree line with Duke pressed anxious and alert against his leg, listening to the muffled shouts of agents clearing rooms inside. It was nearly 20 minutes before Ochoa herself came back out to find him, her face grim, in a way that told Ryan the news, whatever it was, would not be simple. "We found a converted basement level," she said quietly. "Sound-proofed, multiple holding rooms. We've got 11 individuals down there, women mostly, a couple of minors, being held for what looks like coerced labor and worse. Medical supplies, sedatives, restraints, the whole ugly picture. Priya Halstead is one of them. She's alive, dehydrated, drugged, terrified, but alive." Ryan felt something in his chest that had been wound painfully tight for 5 straight days finally begin to loosen. Just slightly. She'd apparently overheard something she wasn't supposed to hear during one of her night shifts. Ochoa continued. "According to the little we've gotten out of her so far, she tried to run with the baby. They caught her at the gate before she made it off the property. And someone panicked and decided the fastest way to buy time and throw off suspicion was to drive the baby 40 miles away and abandon her somewhere that would draw attention away from Ashcombe Manor entirely. Your parking lot was never random, Chief Colt. It was a calculated dump site, chosen specifically because it was far enough from here that nobody would think to connect the two. The cruelty of that calculation, that a terrified infant's life had been treated as an acceptable risk in service of a cover story, settled over Ryan like a physical weight. He thought of Sonny's weak, hoarse cry inside that overheated van, of how close the math had actually come to running out entirely, and he was very glad, in that moment, that Duke's nose had been faster than anyone's careful planning. Desmond Ashcombe himself was found in his study, attempting to feed documents into a shredder, and was taken into custody without incident, his carefully maintained composure crumbling the instant federal agents rather than his usual compliant sheriff's deputies walked through his door. Victor Wren was not on the property that night, having left for what agents would later determine was a prearranged meeting 2 states away, but he was apprehended less than 18 hours later at a private airfield, attempting to board a chartered flight out of the country with 3 passports under 3 different names. Sheriff Wade Purnell's role in the whole affair took longer to fully unravel, but unravel it did. Financial records seized from Ashcombe's study, combined with the PAC donation trail Ryan had already flagged, showed a clear pattern of payments funneled to Purnell in exchange for a standing arrangement to quietly dismiss any noise complaints, welfare checks, or missing persons inquiries connected to the estate. Purnell was arrested at his own home 3 days later, and the look on his face as deputies who had worked under him for years, placed him in handcuffs, told the whole town everything it needed to know about how long that arrangement had likely been running. The story broke wide open across regional and then national news within the week, though most of the early coverage, ironically, focused first on the parking lot rescue itself before the deeper trafficking network came fully to light. Local reporters descended on Fenwick's grocery, and the same Gary who had shouted at Ryan to control his dog 5 days earlier, now found himself giving breathless interviews about how he had, in his own retelling, immediately recognized something was wrong and called for help. Nobody corrected him on camera, though the store's own security footage, once it made its way onto the internet, told a rather different story about who had actually taken action and who had mostly stood around shouting about liability. Sonny Halstead was discharged from the hospital fully recovered within days, and Priya, once medically cleared and debriefed by federal investigators, was reunited with her daughter and her mother in a hospital hallway that, according to everyone who witnessed it, did not have a single dry eye in it, including 2 hardened FBI agents, who insisted they'd just gotten something in their eyes from the ventilation system. Priya's account, once she was strong enough to give it fully, filled in the last remaining gaps. She had taken the night shift job at Ashcombe Manor for the pay, exactly as she'd told her mother, with no idea what she was walking into. Over several weeks she had begun noticing things that didn't add up, women who arrived and were never introduced to the rest of the staff, meals brought down to a basement level she'd been told was simply storage, hushed arguments between Ashcombe and Wren about shipments and schedules that had nothing to do with anything she recognized as home health care. The night everything came apart, she had gone looking for a supply closet and stumbled instead on the soundproofed holding level, and within minutes of that discovery, Wren's men had found her. She had tried, in a desperate final act before they caught her, to reach her car with Sonny, hoping to simply drive away and call for help from somewhere safe. She never made it past the front gate. What happened after that, the decision by Wren's men to drug her, take the child, and stage the abandonment 40 miles away as a diversion, while they decided what to do with Priya herself, was, according to Agent Okoa, a chillingly practiced maneuver, suggesting this was very far from the first time the operation had needed to make an inconvenient witness disappear. It had very nearly worked. If Ryan Colt had not been standing in a checkout line at exactly the right moment, if Duke had not caught a scent trained into him years earlier on a different continent entirely, if either man or dog had simply decided that morning to skip the grocery run, Sonny Halstead would very likely not have survived the afternoon, and her mother's disappearance might never have been connected to anything more than a tragic, unsolved case quietly closed by a sheriff who had every financial incentive not to look too closely. The investigation into the wider trafficking network took federal agents into records and properties across 4 states over the following months, ultimately connecting Ashcombe Manor to at least 6 other similar operations and identifying more than 30 additional victims. Desmond Ashcombe and Victor Wren were both indicted on a sweeping list of federal charges, including conspiracy, forced labor, and trafficking of persons, facing sentences that would very likely keep both men behind bars for the remainder of their natural lives. Sheriff Purnell, facing his own separate charges of corruption and obstruction of justice, agreed to a cooperation deal that provided investigators with additional documentation of the payment scheme, though it did little to soften the fury of a town that had trusted him with their safety for nearly 2 decades. Larkspur Hollow held a town meeting in the same community hall where high school basketball games were usually played, and it was, by every account, the most crowded that Hall had been in living memory. The interim sheriff appointed by the state, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Chief Deputy Alvarez, who had been passed over for promotion twice under Purnell's tenure, specifically because she asked too many uncomfortable questions, laid out for the assembled townspeople exactly what had happened, and exactly how close it had come to staying buried forever. Ryan hadn't planned on speaking that night. He sat near the back with Duke lying quietly at his feet, hoping to slip out unnoticed the way he generally preferred, and it was Margaret Halstead who spotted him first and would not let him get away with quiet anonymity. She stood up from her seat beside her daughter and grandbubby and asked, in a voice that carried clearly through the packed hall, whether the man who had actually broken that car window and asked the questions nobody else in this town had been willing to ask might like to say a few words. The room turned to look at him, and for a long moment Ryan sat very still, feeling the old familiar discomfort of attention. He'd never sought and didn't particularly want, but he thought of Sonny's weak cry, of Priya's shaking hands, of a sheriff who had built 19 years of quiet complicity on the assumption that nobody would ever look closely enough to notice. And he stood up anyway. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, and a ripple of gentle laughter moved through the crowd, easing some of the tension. "I'll just say this. My dog heard something the rest of us didn't. That's really the whole story. He didn't care what kind of car it was, or who owned the property down the road, or whether asking questions would make anybody uncomfortable. He just knew something was wrong, and he wouldn't quit until somebody listened." He paused, looking out at the room full of familiar faces that had, until a week ago, been strangers to him. Maybe the lesson in that is pretty simple. When something feels wrong, even if everybody around you is telling you to let it go, you don't let it go. You keep asking the question until somebody finally answers it. The applause that followed lasted longer than Ryan was entirely comfortable with, and Duke, sensing the shift in energy, sat up straight and looked around the room with the calm, watchful dignity of an animal who had once again done exactly what he was trained to do, and expected nothing more than a scratch behind the ears for it. But the story did not end with a town meeting and a round of applause. Justice, especially the kind that involves men with Desmond Ashcombe's resources, rarely moves quickly, and it almost never moves without a fight. The months between the raid on Ashcombe Manor and the eventual federal trial were, in their own quieter way, just as tense as the night Ryan had crouched in the rain, watching that panel van unload its cargo. Ashcombe's legal team, a rotating cast of expensive attorneys flown in from 3 different cities, mounted an aggressive campaign almost immediately, filing motion after motion to suppress evidence, arguing that Ryan's initial surveillance from the tree line constituted an unlawful search, that Duke's alert on the minivan 5 days earlier had no scientific validity as probable cause, that the entire chain of events had been triggered by an overzealous civilian playing soldier on private property he had no legal right to observe. For a while, it seemed almost possible that a jury of paid experts and procedural technicalities might succeed in doing what Sheriff Purnell's corruption alone could not, burying the truth under a mountain of legal noise until it simply stopped being interesting to anyone outside Larkspur Hollow. Agent Okoa called Ryan personally to warn him that he would very likely be summoned to testify, and that the defense would try, in her words, to make him look unstable, to paint a picture of a traumatized combat veteran who had manufactured a conspiracy out of nothing more than an overactive sense of danger left over from deployment. "They're going to go after your service record," she told him over the phone, her voice carrying the weary patience of someone who had seen this exact playbook run a dozen times before. "They're going to bring up things you'd probably rather not discuss in open court. I need you to be ready for that, and I need you to hold the line anyway." Ryan spent the weeks leading up to the trial preparing the way he prepared for anything difficult, methodically, without drama, running through every likely line of questioning with Hollis Grant over the phone late into the night, reviewing his own timeline of events until he could recite it forward and backward without hesitation. He was not, by nature, a man who enjoyed being the center of attention and the prospect of sitting in a witness box while a well-dressed attorney tried to unravel his credibility in front of a room full of strangers filled him with a dread that no firefight ever quite had. But he thought again of Sonny's weak cry, of Priya's shaking hands in that hospital hallway, of the 11 other people found in that soundproofed basement whose names had never made the news, and he understood that this, too, was simply another kind of mission, one that required a different kind of courage than the one he'd spent his career training for. The trial itself opened on a cold morning in early winter. The federal courthouse, 2 counties overpacked with reporters, trafficking survivor advocates, and a healthy contingent of Larkspur Hollow residents who had driven over in a convoy of pickup trucks and sedans simply to sit in the gallery and bear witness. Priya Halstead testified first, her voice steady despite everything. Walking the jury through the night, she discovered the basement level, the panic of trying to reach her car with Sonny, the terror of being caught at the gate. Margaret sat in the front row throughout, holding Sonny on her lap, and more than one juror was seen wiping their eyes as Priya described hearing her daughter crying somewhere far away while she herself lay drugged and helpless, unable to do anything but pray that someone would find her. When it was Ryan's turn to take the stand, Ashcombe's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Corbin Wexler, who had built a career defending exactly this kind of client, wasted no time pursuing the strategy Ocho had predicted. He spent the better part of an hour walking Ryan through his military record, asking pointed questions about combat stress, about whether Ryan had ever sought treatment for anything resembling hypervigilance or paranoia, about whether it was possible, just possible, that a man trained for over a decade to see threats everywhere might have simply imagined a conspiracy where none existed, chasing shadows in a quiet mountain town because some part of him needed an enemy to fight. Ryan answered every question calmly, without flinching, without raising his voice, the same steady discipline that had carried him through worse rooms than this one. "I've been trained to notice things other people miss," he said, when Wexler pushed particularly hard on the subject of his psychological fitness. "That's not a flaw, counselor. That's the entire reason a baby is alive today instead of in a morgue. My dog didn't imagine a chemical scent on that van." Federal forensics confirmed the sedative residue independently, without my input, days after Duke first alerted on it. You can question my nerves all you like. You can't argue with a lab report. The courtroom, according to more than one reporter present that day, went very quiet after that answer, and Wexler, sensing the jury's mood shifting firmly against his line of attack, moved on to a different subject far sooner than he had clearly planned to. The forensic and financial evidence, once fully presented, proved simply too overwhelming for even Ashcomb's considerable resources to overcome. Seized ledgers detailed years of payments to Sheriff Purnell in exchange for suppressed reports. Cell tower data placed Victor Wren's phone at the property during the exact window Priya had been caught trying to flee. DNA and fingerprint evidence from the basement level connected directly to at least 4 other reported missing persons cases across 2 states. Cases that federal investigators had never previously been able to link to a physical location. And underlying all of it, playing on repeat for the jury during closing arguments, was the raw, unedited footage from Fenwick's grocery's own security camera, showing a German shepherd straining at his leash toward a locked minivan, and a stranger who did not hesitate for even a second before breaking that window to save a child he had never met. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. Desmond Ashcombe was convicted on all 14 counts, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, forced labor, and obstruction of justice, and was ultimately sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Victor Wren, tried separately given the additional evidence tying him to operations in other states, received a similarly severe sentence just weeks later. Sheriff Purnell, having already accepted his cooperation deal, was sentenced to 12 years for corruption and obstruction, a sentence that struck most of Larkspur Hollow as generous given the scale of what his silence had allowed to continue unchecked for so long. Though few had the energy left to argue the point, after everything the town had already been through. In the weeks that followed, the town of Larkspur Hollow began, slowly and imperfectly, the work of rebuilding trust in institutions that had failed it so completely. The state appointed Chief Deputy Alvarez as permanent sheriff, and one of her first official acts was to establish an independent citizen oversight board with real subpoena power, specifically designed to prevent any future arrangement like the one Purnell had run for so long. Ashcombe Manor's grounds, seized as part of the federal case, were eventually transferred to a non-profit that converted the property into a trauma recovery and transitional housing center for trafficking survivors, an outcome that struck most of the town as a fittingly poetic use for a place that had caused so much harm. Margaret Halstead sold her house in the neighboring state and moved to Larkspur Hollow permanently to be near her daughter and granddaughter, and she and Priya became, in their own quiet way, fixtures of the community. Priya eventually returning to nursing work at the very hospital that had once treated her daughter, this time by choice and free of any shadow hanging over her. Ryan finished out his convalescent leave in the cabin his aunt had left him, and though his orders would eventually call him back to active duty, he found himself, for the first time in years, actually looking forward to the return rather than dreading the absence of stillness. Something about Larkspur Hollow, about the porch steps he'd finally gotten around to fixing, and the shutters he'd painted a deep forest green, about the diner regulars who now waved at him by name, had done for him exactly what he'd hoped this leave might accomplish. He had come here to remember how to be a person instead of an instrument, and somewhere in the middle of breaking a car window and chasing a scent through a rainstorm, he had found his way back to himself. Gary from Fenwick's grocery, in a small gesture that surprised absolutely everyone, including himself, replaced the shattered rear window of the Halstead minivan out of his own pocket once the vehicle was finally released from evidence, and quietly asked Ryan if he wouldn't mind stopping by the store sometime. No cameras, no interviews, just so he could shake his hand properly and apologize for how he'd acted that first afternoon. Ryan did stop by a few weeks later, and the two of them stood in the same parking lot where it had all started, saying very little, which suited both of them fine. Some conversations don't need many words to matter. Chief Deputy turned Sheriff Alvarez kept her promise about the oversight board, and within her first 6 months in office, Larkspur Hollow's tiny police department had more transparent record keeping than departments 5 times its size, a fact she credited, with a wry smile, entirely to a stubborn combat medic and his dog, forcing the whole town to finally ask the question nobody had wanted to ask for 19 years. She and Ryan stayed in occasional contact, even after he returned to active duty, trading the odd email whenever a case reminded her of the parking lot, or whenever Ryan found himself wondering how the town he'd only meant to pass through for a few quiet weeks was getting along without him. The 11 survivors recovered from the basement level at Ashcombe Manor scattered to rebuild their lives across half a dozen states, each carrying forward a version of the same quiet, hard-won resilience Priya Halstead had shown from her very first day back in the world. Federal Victim Services connected most of them with counseling, housing assistance, and job placement, and Agent Ochoa made a point of personally checking in on each of them for months afterward. A level of dedication that told Ryan everything he needed to know about why her task force had actually managed to close a case that had eluded investigators for the better part of a year before he and Duke stumbled into it. Duke, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by his sudden minor fame. Photos of him sitting alert beside that shattered minivan window had circulated widely enough online that strangers occasionally recognized him on his walks around Larkspur Hollow, stopping to ask if this was really the dog from the news, and Duke accepted their attention with the same unbothered dignity he brought to everything else, tail wagging politely, nose already moving on to the next interesting scent along the trail. He had no interest in being a celebrity. He had only ever been interested in doing the job in front of him, and the job, as far as Duke was concerned, had simply been a baby who needed help, and nobody else close enough to hear her. On his last evening before returning to base, Ryan sat on the porch with Duke's head heavy across his lap, watching the fog begin its slow evening crawl back down from the ridge. Margaret and Priya had come by earlier with Sunny, now a bright, healthy, giggling baby who had taken an immediate and enthusiastic liking to Duke, gripping fistfuls of his fur with the fearless confidence only a very young child can have around a very large dog. Duke had endured it all with the patient, gentle stillness of an animal who somehow always seemed to know exactly how much force he could safely allow around the smallest and most vulnerable people in any room. "You did good, buddy," Ryan said quietly, scratching behind Duke's ears, and the dog let out a low, contented sigh, the closest thing to agreement a German shepherd could offer. People often assume that heroism looks like something loud and dramatic, a single decisive act captured forever on camera. But the truth more often looks like a dog who refuses to stop barking at a locked car door, and a tired man who trusts that bark enough to break a window without waiting for permission. It looks like patience and stubbornness and the simple, unglamorous decision to keep asking questions long after everyone else has decided it's easier to stop. Sunny Halstead will grow up, never remembering the day she nearly didn't make it out of that parking lot. And maybe that's for the best. But somewhere down the road, when she's old enough to understand it, her mother and grandmother will tell her the story of the tired stranger and his loyal dog who simply refused to walk away from a stranger's crying baby, and how that single choice, multiplied by one dog's trained nose and one man's stubborn conscience, ended up unraveling something far larger and darker than anyone in that quiet mountain town ever could have imagined. Larkspur Hollow, for its part, settled slowly back into something resembling its old rhythm, though nobody who lived through that autumn would ever quite look at the fog rolling down off the ridge the same way again. The hardware store still had its wooden porch. The diner still served the same 3 specials it had served for 40 years. But there was, underneath all of it now, a quieter, more grounded understanding that safety was never something a small town, simply inherited by virtue of being small and quiet, that it had to be actively protected, questioned, and defended, sometimes by the very people least likely to volunteer for the job. Margaret liked to tell anyone who would listen that she believed everything happens for a reason, that some unseen hand had guided a tired combat medic and his scarred, retired working dog into that particular parking lot on that particular afternoon. Ryan never quite subscribed to that kind of thinking himself, having seen too much in his career to believe the universe kept careful score of who deserved rescuing and who didn't. He preferred a simpler explanation, one that didn't require faith so much as attention. A dog had heard something nobody else was listening for, and a man had trusted him enough to act on it immediately, without waiting for permission or proof. Everything else, the federal raid, the trial, the collapse of a corrupt sheriff's long and comfortable reign, had followed from that one uncomplicated decision to listen and to move. This story is a powerful reminder that courage doesn't always arrive wearing a uniform or announcing itself with fanfare. Sometimes it looks like a scarred, retired working dog who refuses to give up on a stranger, and a quiet man willing to trust that instinct even when everyone around him wants an easy answer instead of an uncomfortable truth. It reminds us that real protection means asking the hard questions, even when doing so puts us at risk, and that a single act of persistence can save far more lives than the one directly in front of us. May we all carry a little bit of that same stubborn courage, the willingness to notice when something feels wrong and refuse to look away until the truth comes fully into the light. If this story moved you, if you believe that loyalty, instinct, and quiet courage can still change the world, please type Amen in the comments below. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that heroes still walk among us, often on 4 legs just as much as 2. Leave a comment and let us know your thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Before you go, tell us, which country are you watching from tonight?